What if England's crown was passed not just through bloodlines, but through secrets? Behind the portraits, beneath the thrones, lingered whispers of forbidden bonds, vanished favourites, and kings who loved in shadows. For centuries, history scrubbed them clean. But the silences remain, and sometimes silence says everything. Tonight, we dig beneath the velvet and gold to unearth 30 royal lives and the hidden love stories history refused to tell. Welcome to 30 Secret Gay Kings of England. This isn't a scandal, it's a pattern. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story history tried to bury. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you're listening to this? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We're building a timeline of listeners one secret king at a time. William II, Rufus, Re, 1087, 1100. There was something about William Rufus that didn't sit right with the medieval chroniclers. Maybe it was the hair shockingly red, like he'd been set on fire and left smouldering. Maybe it was the temper sharp, theatrical, flaring at the smallest slight. Or maybe it was the fact that he never married, never sired a child, and kept a court that looked, to the God-fearing men of the 11th century, suspiciously like a stage full of young, well-dressed bachelors. William Rufus, second son of William the Conqueror, inherited England in 1087 and immediately turned the castle into something of a bachelor pad. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who wrote with the cautious pensiveness of someone who had seen too much, described Rufus's court as decadent and unmanly, filled with painted faces, tight hose, and effeminate customs. In the minds of churchmen, this was not just fashion forward. This was moral collapse. He was flamboyant, in the medieval sense of the word. Expensive clothes, an aversion to the church, rumours of paganism, a tendency to surround himself with handsome young nobles. If any king ever felt like he was born in the wrong century, it was probably William Rufus, trapped in a world where eyeliner was a crime against God and lace was a political statement. But here's the thing, no one ever said it outright. No one used the words we might be tempted to throw at him now. Instead, they danced around the accusation like it was a bonfire in the woods. They said he was immoral, that he kept himself from women, that he was too fond of the company of youths. They said his reign was cursed because of sins of the flesh, but left the rest to your imagination. That's how you accuse a king when you're terrified of losing your head. You make your gossip sound like theology. Rufus's opposition to the church certainly didn't help. He refused to appoint bishops unless they paid him for the honour. He kept the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant for years, pocketing the revenues. When he finally did appoint someone, it was only under the pressure of a near-death experience, a miraculous illness, he claimed, and even then, he hated the man he appointed. Anselm, the new archbishop, loathed Rufus in return. He called the king's court a pit of sin and said it was full of men who feared neither God nor man. Translation: Rufus's court was too gay for the church to handle. Then there was the matter of his death. The 2nd of August, 1100. William Rufus rides out into the New Forest with a small hunting party. He doesn't come back. A stray arrow hits him in the chest, allegedly fired by a man named Walter Tyrrell. Accidents happen, so they say. But the body was left in the woods abandoned like a warning. Tyrrell fled to France. No one ever punished him. No one asked too many questions. Maybe it was just a hunting accident. Maybe it was a subtle regicide. Or maybe just maybe, someone decided England had had enough of its red-haired, unmarried, glitter-drenched monarch and arranged for a less ambiguous king to take the throne. The crown passed quietly to Henry I, who married within months. The courtiers put away their eyeliner. The church breathed a sigh of relief. The rumours, however, never stopped. And neither did the pattern. Because just a few generations later, England would crown a king even more dazzling, even more dangerous. And, if the whispers are to be believed, even more enamoured with the touch of a fellow sovereign, a man who didn't just flirt with France, but allegedly shared a bed with it. Richard the Lionheart, 1189–1199. Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king, the chivalric icon, the man who spent more time in chainmail than in Westminster, has been mythologized into near divinity by poets, nationalists, and Hollywood producers alike. He was the ideal medieval monarch, they say. Brave, charismatic, devout. He charged into battle with a sword in one hand and the cross in the other. He barely spoke English, rarely set foot in England, and yet somehow became its patriotic poster boy. And yet, beneath the lion banners and battlefield glamour lies a peculiar silence, the kind of silence that historians start to squint at. A silence filled with rumours, contradictions, and most suspiciously elaborate court poetry written to other men. Born in Oxford, but raised in the Aquitanian courts of southern France, Richard was steeped in the world of troubadours, minstrels, and coded verse. This was not the England of stiff collars and awkward dining. This was the world of veiled flirtations, flowery oaths, and knightly affection that tiptoed dangerously close to erotic. Richard, fluent in this dialect of affection, grew into a man who embodied the courtly ideal, but with some adjustments. He never fathered a legitimate child. He married once, but the union was strategic, political, and perfunctory. His bride, Berengaria of Navarre, never bore him an heir, never even joined him in England. In fact, it's unclear if they ever spent a single night together alone. Chroniclers barely mentioned her. His letters barely mentioned her. His heart, it seems, belonged elsewhere. And then there's the matter of Philip. Philip II of France, that is Richard's fellow crusader, political rival, and, depending on which 12th century monk you ask, his occasional bedmate. In 1187, the two kings formed an alliance that was so close, so unusually intimate, that the chroniclers began to fidget in their robes. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden, not known for salacious writing, said that the kings ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Some say this was just diplomatic hospitality. Others raised an eyebrow and never lowered it. Now, it must be said, sharing a bed in the medieval period was not necessarily romantic. Beds were expensive. So was firewood. Kings and nobles often shared rooms and mattresses, especially in military campaigns. But this particular relationship drew unusual commentary, and not just from enemies. Even friendly chroniclers, the ones paid to make Richard look good, seemed uncomfortable with the bond. And there were gestures. Richard once publicly stripped himself of his royal garments and lay before Philip as a vassal in a symbolic gesture of submission, a political move, sure, but also a dramatically intimate one. It's hard to imagine Henry VIII pulling that stunt with Francis I of France. It's harder still to imagine Richard doing it for any woman. Later in life, after years of war and crusading, Richard made a public confession of sins before the Pope. The specific nature of those sins, left out of the records, suspiciously vague. One historian, writing a century later, suggested that Richard's penitence was related to the sin of Sodom, Though again, medieval euphemism can be maddeningly ambiguous. But ambiguity was Richard's domain. He was a man who lived in allegory, who traded in symbols. He spent 6 months besieging a single castle just to avenge a perceived insult. He spent 10 years away from his kingdom to fight in foreign wars. He ruled England like a landlord, distant, demanding, and rarely present. And yet the country mourned him like a native son. When he died, shot by a crossbow bolt during a siege in 1199, his body was divided literally. His heart was buried in Rouen, his entrails in Limousin, and the rest in Anjou. Symbolic? Certainly, but also suspicious. You don't divide a king unless you're trying to manage a legacy, unless you're trying to hide something. In the centuries that followed, Richard's image was scrubbed clean by historians who needed a national hero, not a man of poetic contradictions. They painted over the rumors. They streamlined the story. But the trail of ink is still there, bleeding between the lines of troubadour lyrics and treaties, because sometimes the most revealing thing a king ever does is share a bed. And the next king, he didn't just share a bed. He built a kingdom out of favorites, glittering, powerful, dangerously intimate favorites, and then he fell for one of them. Hard. If you're still with us, and we know you are, now's the perfect time to subscribe. There are 28 kings still waiting in the wings, and trust us, it only gets stranger from here. While you're listening, drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it? Are you walking your dog in Toronto or lying in bed in Bangkok at 3 a.m.? We're mapping the kingdom of night owls and curious minds, and you're part of it. Edward II, var 1307, 1327. It is perhaps fitting that Edward II was the son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, a man so fiercely obsessed with order, masculinity, and martial glory that he probably considered smiling a sign of weakness. In contrast, his son was different. Where his father crushed rebellions with cold efficiency, Edward II built flower gardens and invented new ways to thatch a roof. Literally, he left behind records discussing his interest in agriculture, fish ponds, and construction techniques. His tastes leaned pastoral rather than imperial, and his affections, well, that's where the trouble started. From the beginning of his reign in 1307, Edward's favoritism toward one man, Piers Gaveston, caused a political earthquake. Gaveston was everything Edward was not: bold, arrogant, charming, flamboyant. He wore clothes so rich and eccentric they made noblemen scoff out loud. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham wrote that Gaveston offended the nobles by the way he dressed, by his speech, and by the excessive familiarity with which the king treated him. In other words, he was loud, proud, and dangerously close to the throne. Edward elevated Gaveston almost immediately after becoming king. He gave him titles, land, and influence far beyond his station. He even appointed him Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for the king's own family. That might seem like a gesture of political favour, but to the barons of England, it was a slap in the face. This wasn't just a friendship. This was a spectacle. Chroniclers at the time tiptoed around the nature of their bond. Some used phrases like excessive affection. Others were more blunt. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, a chronicle by an anonymous monk, describes how the king loved an evil man more than he loved his own wife. Edward, married to Isabella of France, a formidable and politically shrewd queen, barely concealed his disinterest in her. At their coronation, he gave the place of honour not to Isabella, but to Gaveston. It was, in medieval terms, a scandal. And yet, it was also politically suicidal. The nobles, already irritated by Gaveston's behaviour, began to see him as a usurper of royal influence. He mocked them at court. He gave them insulting nicknames. He once referred to the Earl of Warwick as the Black Dog of Arden, which, to medieval ears, was not just rude, it was practically treasonous. Eventually, the pressure built too high. Gaveston was exiled not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each time, Edward brought him back. Each time, the nobility grew more furious. Finally, in 1312, a group of barons captured Gaveston, tried him in a kangaroo court, and executed him without royal permission. Edward's grief was real, immediate, and politically devastating. He swore revenge. But more importantly, he didn't stop, because a few years later, another favourite emerged, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was sharper, colder, more calculating than Gaveston, and just as resented. This time, the favouritism was coupled with genuine tyranny. Edward allowed Despenser to confiscate lands, punish enemies, and even manipulate legal proceedings. Once again, the court began to feel less like a government and more like a tightly curated clique. By the late 1322, the barons weren't just grumbling, they were plotting. And this time, Isabella was done playing the neglected queen. She allied herself with Roger Mortimer, her lover and political partner, and launched a full-blown rebellion against her husband. Edward was captured, humiliated, and forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son. It was a collapse, not just of a king, but of an idea that a monarch could rule by affection rather than alliance. That sentiment could replace strategy. That love, whatever form it took, could survive the brutal machinery of medieval politics. Edward died in captivity in 1327. The official cause of death remains ambiguous. Over the years, legends have proliferated many lurid, all unconfirmed. What remains, however, is a quieter kind of tragedy. A man whose reign became synonymous with emotional vulnerability in a time when kings were supposed to bleed stone. And history, of course, remembers him not for the wars he lost or the treaties he bungled, but for the men he loved and the price he paid for it. But if Edward was doomed by affection, the next monarch carried his contradictions even further, a king whose friendships were just as intense, just as whispered about, but wrapped in a different kind of mystery. One with a Scottish crown, a tragic fate, and a series of relationships that history still doesn't know quite what to do with. James I of Scotland, or 614-37. James I of Scotland spent nearly half his life as a royal hostage. That's not a metaphor. He was literally captured at sea by English pirates while fleeing to France, and spent the next 18 years in English custody. From age 12 to 30, he lived not in a dungeon but in the comfortable confines of an English court, educated alongside noble sons and heirs, absorbing languages, poetry, politics, and, some whispered, certain social inclinations that didn't quite align with Scotland's more traditional expectations of a warrior king. His reign, when it finally began in earnest in 1424, was a study in contradiction, a hardened man with the mind of a poet. A captive turned king who spoke with the polish of an English courtier but ruled with the steel will of someone who had lost far too much time. He came back to Scotland, a stranger, fluent in English tastes, English styles, and, according to rumour, English habits. James married Joan Beaufort, a noble Englishwoman, almost immediately upon his release. It was political, of course, but the royal propaganda machine insisted it was romantic, a story of love blossoming in captivity. He even wrote a long poetic account of how he first saw her from his prison window and fell instantly in love. The poem, The King is Queer, became one of the earliest works in Scots literature. It's heartfelt, moving, strangely perfect, maybe too perfect. Because behind the courtly verse and arranged love story, there are odd gaps in the narrative spaces where real emotion is conspicuously absent, and other names begin to surface. Male names, noble names, page boys and squires, men whose favour seemed to come at a cost. One name stands out in particular, William Chalmers. A courtier and musician, Chalmers served in James's household and was repeatedly rewarded with generous gifts, titles, and unusually intimate access to the king. Chroniclers noted their close friendship but stopped short of explaining it. The details remain frustratingly vague, but the gestures land, money, personal assignments paint a picture of affection that was intense, at the very least. Then there's the curious case of James's court restructuring. Upon returning to Scotland, he removed nearly every influential noble from his household and replaced them with younger, more loyal men, many of them without clear family lineage or political standing. It looked, to some, less like administrative reform and more like a personal curation, a hand-picked circle of beautiful, well-dressed young men. The whispers grew, and whisper they did. Scotland in the 15th century was not a forgiving place for rumours, especially not those that strayed from heteronormative norms. James's personality, witty, charming, but sometimes cruel, made him difficult to pin down. Was he simply eccentric, or was he carefully guarding something more delicate beneath the polished mask? He ruled decisively, if not always wisely. His reforms were radical. He imposed English-style laws, demanded taxes, and tried to centralize power, which, in Scotland, is just another way of asking to be murdered. And eventually, someone obliged. In 1437, a group of disgruntled nobles assassinated James in a grisly coup, cornering him in a monastery while he tried, unsuccessfully, to escape through a blocked sewer channel. His body was left behind, brutally wounded, but again, we are not here to linger on the violence. We are here for what followed. A collective silence. His wife, Joan, tried to hold the crown for their son, James II. The court reshuffled. The inner circle vanished, replaced by older, more politically stable faces. And James's legacy became something of a footnote, a romantic poet, a reformer, a hostage-turned-king who ruled too harshly and died too young. But the relationships he fostered, the closeness, the selective intimacy, the peculiar pattern of favoritism remained a puzzle, one that historians either ignore or quietly write around. Because James's life posed a challenge. How do you categorize a king who wrote like a lover, ruled like a tyrant, and surrounded himself with men he seemed to trust more than his own family? Was it courtly affection? Emotional dependence? Something deeper that never made it into the annals of Scottish history? We'll never know, but we do know this. He wasn't the last. Because the next king on our list, Edward III, inherited not just a kingdom, but an entire generation of carefully polished silences. And behind his glittering wars and golden reputation lies another set of peculiar attachments that nobody ever quite managed to explain. Edward III, Roar 1327, 1377. Edward III is usually remembered as the king who launched the 100 Years' War, wore his crown like a military helmet, and built the English monarchy into a medieval war machine. His reign was long, his campaigns were legendary, and his style was decisively masculine, all chainmail and chivalry, with tournaments thrown in between sieges, and a family tree that sprawled like ivy across the noble houses of Europe. But look a little closer. and the chinks in the armour begin to show not in the wars or the politics, but in the spaces where historians tend to mumble and turn the page. Because behind all the conquest and coronation, Edward surrounded himself with a court that resembled not so much a military council as a boy band. And at the centre of this glittering, suspiciously well-groomed retinue were a handful of knights and courtiers who were, depending on who you ask, either fiercely loyal or something more. First, let's talk about William Montague, 1st Earl of Salisbury. He was young, daring, and so inseparable from Edward during the early years of his reign that many chroniclers didn't even bother listing him as a companion. They just wrote his name next to the king's as if they were a unit. Montague helped Edward overthrow the regency of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. He led the charge into Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel in 1330, confronting Mortimer in his bedchamber and ending the de facto rule of the Queen Mother. That kind of trust, the kind that lets someone sneak into your mother's stronghold and topple your government for you, doesn't come from a few games of chess. Edward rewarded Montague lavishly, lands, titles, and the highest honours at court. When Montague died, his loss was described in unusually emotional terms by the king's inner circle, not in the usual language of military mourning, but with a tone that sounded more personal. And then came another, Sir Richard de la Vache, Knight of the Garter, another fixture in Edward's circle whose rise at court was swift, unexplained, and the subject of considerable gossip. Again, generous gifts. Again, intimate appointments. Again, silence. In the official record, when it came to what, exactly, made these men so indispensable. But here's the thing. Edward was a builder of mythology, and he knew how to cloak intimacy in honour. In 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter, England's highest order of chivalry, and handpicked its original members. On the surface, it was a celebration of knightly virtue. But the ceremony, the rituals, the symbols, garters exchanged, oaths sworn in candlelight, carried the emotional weight of a secret society. Some historians have suggested the order was Edward's way of enshrining a certain kind of closeness under the banner of honour, a space where intimacy between men could be coded, legitimised, and shielded from the church's more literal interpretations. The court poetry of the time, much of it anonymous, leans heavily into this, not naming names, but weaving tales of knights so bound to each other in loyalty and affection that the lines blur between political brotherhood and emotional devotion. Some of it reads more like love letters than ballads. And while heterosexual romance certainly existed in the literature of Edward's court, it's striking how often male bonds are centred, idealised, elevated, and veiled just enough to avoid clerical interference. Even Edward's relationship with his own sons follows the same strange rhythm. His affection for the Black Prince, his eldest, bordered on the obsessive. He micromanaged his military training, mourned his death with an intensity rarely seen in royal households, and spent his final years retreating from politics altogether after losing him. And yet, with all the pageantry of Edward's reign, all the documentation of battles and treaties, the king's inner emotional world remains elusive, but pointed. What survives are moments, glances in letters, patterns of promotion, a court roster that reads like a carefully curated list of favourites. The kind of clues you don't notice until you ask the wrong, or maybe the right questions. Of course, no one accused Edward directly. He had a queen, after all. He fathered many children, but so did many others on this list. Affection, in medieval politics, wore disguises. Sometimes it looked like chivalry, sometimes like camaraderie, sometimes it looked like love, tucked between the folds of a ceremonial robe. And just as Edward began to perfect the art of hiding in plain sight, the next king took a sharper turn. A man who wore his contradictions like armor, who waged war not just abroad but inside his own castle, a king whose attachment to a single courtier would ignite a rebellion, fracture a kingdom, and leave behind a trail of questions still unanswered. Henry II, or 1154-1189. Henry II was the kind of king who didn't just rule, he dominated. Loud, volatile, brilliant, endlessly energetic. He rode horses into the ground, shouted at bishops until they fainted, and governed an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees with the raw intensity of a man who never really learned how to sit still. He had a temper that once reportedly made his own servants hide under tables, and yet, behind that volcanic rage and political genius, there were peculiarities, not least of which was a famously intense friendship with a man who would one day become a saint and a martyr. Enter Thomas Becket, Archdeacon of Canterbury, later Archbishop. But before all that, Becket was just Henry's favourite, a man pulled from the ranks of middle nobility and promoted so quickly it made everyone else dizzy. They were, by all accounts, inseparable. Becket was everything Henry wasn't: reserved, calculating, elegantly dressed, unflappably calm. Where Henry was fire, Becket was polished steel. And yet the king doted on him like an older brother, or depending on how you squint at the historical record, something even closer. In the beginning, their bond was dazzling. Henry made Becket Chancellor of England, showered him with wealth, gave him authority that few had ever wielded outside the royal bloodline. They dined together, travelled together, even hunted together, a privilege rarely extended to those outside the family. Some chroniclers described them as soulmates. Others hinted at an unnatural closeness, though as always, medieval euphemism is infuriatingly vague. One detail often overlooked: Henry, who was famously impatient with fools, sycophants, and anyone who dared challenge his will, deferred to Becket with striking frequency. He joked with him, confided in him, let him handle delicate affairs of state. There are even records of Henry embracing Becket in public, a gesture that, while not unheard of between powerful men of the time, was still eyebrow-raising when paired with everything else. But of course, the story of Henry and Becket doesn't end with friendship. It ends with betrayal. When Henry made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, he expected a puppet, a man who would help him consolidate power over the church. What he got instead was a defiant cleric who suddenly developed a spine. Becket transformed, seemingly overnight, into a holy warrior, challenging royal authority at every turn. The closeness shattered. The love, if that's what it had been, curdled into rage. Historians often debate what exactly went wrong. Was it political, moral, personal, or was it, in a quiet and unspoken way, emotional? Did Henry feel abandoned not just as a monarch, but as a man? Some letters from the period suggest a profound sense of personal betrayal, as if Henry had been jilted. He was furious, yes, but wounded too. Not just in public, but in private. And yet, despite everything, Henry never quite erased Becket from his heart. After Becket's death, famously and brutally orchestrated by 4 knights who thought they were doing the king a favour, Henry publicly grieved. He walked barefoot through the streets. He submitted to public penance. He wept at Becket's tomb. This was not just political damage control. This was something deeper, something raw. The church, of course, canonized Becket almost immediately. Martyr, saint, miracle worker, but the story beneath the halo remains harder to classify. It's the story of two men whose bond shook the foundations of a kingdom, a friendship that outgrew its own political utility and collapsed under the weight of personal obsession. As for Henry, he never really recovered. His later years were marked by rebellion, betrayal by his sons, and a slow, bitter retreat from the heights of his early reign. The fire dimmed. The empire fractured. And when he finally died in 1189, it was with enemies at his gates, and very few true friends left by his side. But what if the most important relationship of his life had never been about governance at all? What if the real revolution wasn't in the way he ruled, but in the way he felt, the way he trusted, and then couldn't? And what if that pattern, that magnetic pull between kings and the men they raised too high, didn't end with Henry? Because just a few decades later, another king would inherit not just the throne, but the same curious tendency, the same circle of youthful companions, the same rumors all dressed up in courtly robes and spoken in whispers that have never quite died out. Henry III, Rar 1216-1272. To understand Henry III is to understand contradiction wrapped in velvet. He was a king who ruled for over 50 years, one of the longest reigning monarchs in English history, and yet somehow left behind a legacy defined more by mood than might. A ruler who avoided war but sparked civil conflict. A pious man who turned his court into something resembling a theatre set. A husband and father, yes, but also a king with a suspicious fondness for certain male courtiers, fondness that followed a pattern the chroniclers quietly raised their quills over. Henry ascended the throne as a child, following the sudden death of his father, King John, a man so unpopular his name still echoes like a bad omen. Henry, in contrast, was gentle, soft-spoken, emotionally expressive, and perhaps, above all, dependent. Throughout his long reign, he surrounded himself with men he trusted to handle the unpleasant details of ruling, and trusted, in some cases, a little too much. One of the first and most notable was Peter des Roches, Bishop of Winchester. Des Roches became Henry's tutor, mentor, advisor, and gatekeeper, a powerful man with a knack for controlling access to the young king. Contemporary accounts describe their closeness as excessive. Whether it was just an emotional dependency born from childhood trauma or something more, the court took notice. And when Des Roches was replaced by another favourite, Hubert de Burgh, the cycle began again. But Henry's real taste for favourites, or as the nobility saw them, interlopers, emerged fully in his adult reign, especially with his patronage of the Lusignans, his half-brothers from his mother's second marriage. These were handsome, foreign-born young men with little to recommend them besides their family ties and their ability to charm the king. They arrived in England with no real power, and within a few short years, they were among the most influential men in the kingdom. That, alone, would have been enough to spark baronial suspicion. But what truly set tongues wagging was the manner of their rise, fast, lavish, and intimate. Henry showered them with lands, titles, and military commands. He dined with them, travelled with them, consulted them on private matters. Some chroniclers called it favouritism. Others didn't bother with euphemism and accused Henry of unnatural affection. He was also deeply infatuated with the trappings of beauty and display. His court was ornate, filled with perfumed incense, painted walls, imported silk, and French music. Even the royal chapel was styled not like a house of worship but a jewel box, with gold leaf and coloured glass, all at Henry's personal insistence. It was a performance of piety and luxury, and it unnerved the old guard nobility who preferred their kings armoured and shouting. Henry's relationship with Simon de Montfort, the man who would eventually lead a rebellion against him, began, ironically, with another intense bond. Montfort was charismatic, sharp, and religious, with a noble bearing that appealed to Henry's idealized vision of knightly virtue. The two were close for years. Montfort married Henry's sister. Henry trusted him deeply. And then, as with so many of Henry's companions, things soured badly. Montfort accused the Lusignans of corruption. Henry resisted. Civil war followed. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a pattern. Henry elevating a man to prominence, growing too attached, refusing to listen to criticism, and eventually being betrayed or abandoned. And each time, the whispers resumed, not just about governance, but about Henry himself. Was it weakness? Naivety? Or was it a kind of closeted desperation? A yearning for emotional connection in a world where such things had to be wrapped in the language of politics and religion? His wife, Eleanor of Provence, bore him numerous children. By all accounts, they maintained a respectful, cooperative marriage. But it was not passion that defined Henry's life. It was devotion to his friends, his advisors, his ideals, and perhaps most of all, to a certain kind of masculine beauty that kept finding its way into his court and his inner circle. Henry died in 1272, his reign largely overshadowed by the more muscular legacy of his son, Edward I. But Henry left behind something far more peculiar. A trail of emotional attachments buried beneath the gilded surface of his piety. A king remembered less for what he conquered than for whom he kept close. And just when it seemed England had had its fill of introspective monarchs and delicate affections, along came a king who smashed all of that to pieces, a towering figure of wives, wars, and legend. A king famous for his appetites. But if the rumors are to be believed, not all of them pointed in the direction you'd expect. Henry VIII Rar, 1509-1547. Henry VIII is the king most people think they already know, the one with 6 wives, a neck wider than most people's torsos, and a tendency to solve marital problems with an axe. He's the Renaissance poster child for royal ego, bloated excess, and weaponized insecurity. By the end of his reign, he was half king, half myth, a thundering autocrat dripping in gold, pushing entire religions around like chess pieces. And yet, behind the portraits and propaganda, behind the monstrous appetite for control and the famously doomed queens, there are quieter footnotes, whispers about his male companions, moments of emotional intensity with courtiers, bonds that don't quite fit the pattern of mere camaraderie. To be clear, Henry VIII was obsessed with producing a male heir. That much is undeniable. But obsession doesn't always point in a straight line, and if you trace the margins of his life, the edges of power, the early friendships, the sudden fallouts, a different kind of story begins to emerge. One that doesn't replace the familiar tale, but complicates it. Let's start with Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk. Childhood friend, jousting partner, and almost absurdly close to the king. Theirs was a bond forged in youth and war, in tournaments and trust. Brandon was one of the very few men Henry allowed to speak to him as an equal. When Brandon secretly married Henry's sister, Mary Tudor, everyone assumed he'd be executed for it. Instead, Henry forgave him not grudgingly, but completely. That level of mercy was unusual. Brandon was handsome, bold, and intensely loyal. The affection Henry held for him is well documented, but rarely dissected. It doesn't help that most historians, hungry for political drama, have focused on the marriage scandal or Brandon's military service. But the emotional texture of their friendship, the generosity, the dependency, the fact that Henry kept him at court long after their political usefulness to each other had waned raises questions. And Brandon was not the only one. There's also Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber and another court favourite. Though best known for his affair with Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, Culpeper's relationship with the king was far older and more complex. He had extraordinary access to Henry's private quarters. The two often hunted together, and Henry gave him expensive gifts, land, money, influence. Even when Culpeper's behaviour raised eyebrows, Henry protected him, at least until the affair with Catherine emerged. Then there's the curious pattern of Henry's court itself. His privy chamber, the king's most intimate circle, was populated not just with political allies, but with beautiful, athletic young men who shared his love of sport, music, and pageantry. Henry carefully curated this inner sanctum, surrounding himself with companions who could entertain, flatter, and accompany him behind closed doors. The dynamics of that space were intensely performative, dancing, singing, wrestling, composing verse, but they were also intensely personal. The line between servant and confidant, between courtier and companion, was deliberately blurred. One particularly strange case is that of Mark Smeaton, a court musician who was executed during the Anne Boleyn scandal. Smeaton was a man of lower birth, not someone who should have been anywhere near the Queen or the King, and yet he had access. He dined with the aristocracy. Some suggest it wasn't Anne's attention that raised eyebrows, but Henry's. After all, Smeaton was young, talented, and conspicuously well treated, until he was very suddenly not. As usual, the records are careful. The gossip isn't. Later, pamphlets and satirical poems, especially those written after Henry's death, played heavily with innuendo. Some mocked Henry's obsession with male companionship, painting his court as a place of excess not just in wine and women, but in something more effeminate, more suspect. Of course, much of this was political, written by enemies, reformers, or opportunists, but the fact that the accusation even landed suggests a deeper cultural suspicion. Henry VIII has gone down in history as the ultimate heterosexual monarch, defined by his wives, by his need for sons, by his relentless reshaping of England's marital and spiritual architecture. But the closeness of his male friendships, the intensity of his inner court, and the disproportionate rise of certain companions suggest that there were other desires at play. Not always visible, not always spoken, but present, flickering just behind the curtain of royal authority. And after Henry died, England passed to a new generation of kings, some reluctant, some poetic, some far more careless about hiding their affections. Because the next monarch didn't just keep handsome men around him, he called one of them his wife, publicly, repeatedly. And unlike Henry, he didn't seem all that interested in pretending otherwise. James VI and I, Res 1603, 1625. James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603, uniting the crowns after Elizabeth I's death, is often treated as a transitional monarch, a kind of historical hyphen, linking the glittering drama of the Tudors with the civil wars of the Stuarts. But to flatten James to a mere footnote between dynasties is to miss something essential. His reign was one of strange contradictions, political friction, and deeply personal obsessions. And at the centre of it all stood a series of beautiful young men who seemed, by every available account, to own both his heart and his court. The first thing to understand about James is that he was bookish, witty, and painfully self-aware. He wrote treatises on kingship, smoked tobacco like it was a philosophical act, and fancied himself a scholar of divine right. But he was also emotionally needy, desperate for affection. And despite being married to Anne of Denmark and fathering several children, James made little effort to hide where his real affections lay. Enter Esme Stuart, the first in a long line of royal favourites. Stuart was a distant cousin of James, a French Catholic, and, by every description, strikingly handsome. When he arrived at the Scottish court in 1579, James was just 13. The bond was immediate, intense, and alarmingly public. Stuart became Duke of Lennox, was granted near unlimited access to the king, and quickly drew the suspicion and hatred of the Scottish nobility. They accused him of corrupting the king both politically and morally. James in turn defended him with all the fervour of a teenager in love. Eventually, the pressure became too much. Stuart was forced into exile under threat of civil war. James wept. He sulked. He wrote letters that read more like romantic mourning than political correspondence. It wouldn't be the last time. Later in life, as King of England, James found a new favourite, Robert Carr, a young, attractive Scotsman who caught the king's eye after falling off a horse during a joust. James, ever theatrical, rushed to his aid. Carr was immediately swept into court life, promoted through the ranks, and made Viscount Rochester in record time. But Carr, like many of James's companions, was ambitious and eventually reckless. He got tangled up in the infamous Overbury scandal, a political murder case involving poison, lust, and more intrigue than a Jacobean play. Carr's fall from grace was dramatic. James, once again, was heartbroken. And once again, he moved on. Which brings us to George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, James's final and most infamous favourite. Villiers was everything the king liked. Young, elegant, magnetic. He danced well, dressed impeccably, and could banter with the best of them. More importantly, he knew how to play the game. James elevated him rapidly, knighted him, titled him, flooded him with wealth and land. But more striking than the royal favoritism was the language James used to describe their relationship. In letters, James called Villiers "my sweet child and wife, my dear son," and in one particularly famous line told him, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." The letters are cloying, affectionate, deeply emotional, and nearly impossible to read as mere politics. Historians have long debated the nature of their bond, but even the most conservative among them have to acknowledge the undeniable intimacy. And unlike previous monarchs who tried to bury or deny their rumoured relationships, James didn't seem especially interested in hiding anything. He openly embraced Villiers in public. He granted him sleeping quarters adjacent to his own. He called him pet names in front of the court. Foreign ambassadors wrote back to their home countries with barely concealed astonishment, reporting the open affection between king and favourite. Some were scandalised. Others simply accepted it as the price of doing politics with the Stuarts. James's reign was not without its political failures. He struggled with Parliament, mishandled finances, and sowed seeds of unrest that would later bloom into civil war under his son. But his court and his personal life told another story, one of deep emotional reliance, of bonds that crossed the hazy medieval line between brotherhood and something more tender, more dangerous. And James wasn't punished for it. Not really. He wasn't deposed or assassinated or publicly shamed. His affections, however unconventional, were woven into the daily fabric of court life. Normalized, tolerated, sometimes mocked, but rarely condemned. It was as though the sheer force of his attachment made it, in a strange way, untouchable. But of course, James's legacy didn't end with his death. His son, Charles I, inherited more than just the throne. He inherited the same courtly taste, the same emotional hunger, the same dangerous pull toward favourites who promised loyalty and delivered disaster. And once again, it all began with a young man, a powerful family, and a bond that left the country holding its breath. Charles I, 1625–1649. Charles I inherited a kingdom, a wariness of Parliament, and an oddly specific emotional blueprint. A throne already shaped by his father, James's preference for beautifully dressed young men, and deeply personal bonds that blurred the line between public loyalty and private intimacy. But where James had been effusive, all florid letters and theatrical embraces, Charles was cold by comparison. Quiet, reserved, and inward-looking, he ruled less with affection and more with a kind of stubborn dignity. And yet, despite this controlled demeanor, he too found himself gravitating toward the same pattern, a singular male favorite with a scandalous amount of power. The man in question? George Villiers, the very same Duke of Buckingham who had been James I's beloved companion. When Charles came to the throne in 1625, Villiers had already spent nearly a decade at the epicenter of royal influence, rising from courtier to statesman by sheer charm and proximity. Most assumed his grip on power would loosen with James's death, but instead it tightened. Charles and Buckingham were close, extremely close. And though Charles never wrote the kind of syrupy letters that his father had, no sweet wife declarations or handwritten poems, the depth of their relationship was unmistakable. Buckingham accompanied Charles on his controversial trip to Spain in 1623, a diplomatic adventure that ended in failure but served as a bonding moment between the two men. It was a rare glimpse of the guarded prince laughing, relaxing, even teasing, all in the company of a man widely considered the most beautiful in England. The public, however, was less enchanted. From the moment Charles took the throne, Buckingham's continued prominence was viewed as nepotism at best and moral rot at worst. He was blamed for military blunders, foreign policy disasters, and extravagant court spending. Parliament tried repeatedly to have him removed. Charles refused. When asked why, the king is reported to have said, "I am the general of my friends, and he is my lieutenant." It was meant as political loyalty. It sounded like something more. In 1628, the pressure exploded. Buckingham was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier named John Felton. The reaction was chilling. Instead of mourning, the public rejoiced. Bells rang out. People toasted his death. Poems were written in celebration. Charles, for his part, was devastated. He withdrew from public view, refused to speak of the murder, and entered a prolonged period of personal silence that even his closest advisors found unnerving. This was not just political mourning. This was grief, quiet, controlled, and corrosive. In the years that followed, Charles grew more isolated, more inflexible, more inclined to see the crown not as a public trust, but as a private inheritance. Buckingham had been his friend, his advisor, his shield. Without him, Charles seemed unwilling to let anyone else in. He turned instead to ceremony, to religion, to hierarchy and pageantry. The court became more austere, the king more rigid. His marriage to Henrietta Maria of France eventually grew close, even loving, but it was a different kind of intimacy. Political, strategic. A partnership born out of necessity, not yearning. With men, Charles had always been softer, more instinctive, less guarded. After Buckingham, that softness hardened. But the court remembered. Pamphlets circulated hinting at the true nature of the king's devotion. Satirical plays took aim at the way Buckingham had moved through the halls of power, always just a little too close to the royal bedchamber. And while Charles never publicly acknowledged these whispers, he also never quite escaped them. They followed him all the way to trial, where his perceived arrogance and detachment, the quiet, aristocratic coldness he'd honed over years of grief, helped seal his fate. In 1649, Charles I was executed on a cold January morning. His last words were dignified, even brave, but his legacy was fractured, part martyr, part tyrant, part unknowable man. And in that final image, we find the same strange paradox that haunted so many kings before him. A life ruled not just by politics and principle, but by personal attachment, always concealed in ritual, always half-glimpsed through the haze of ceremony and silence. And silence, as history has shown, doesn't mean absence. Because the next king didn't just keep his secrets under wraps, he drowned them in scandal, masked them in mistresses, and danced his way across England's moral boundaries until nobody knew what he wanted, or whom. A man of shadows, wigs, and winks. And behind all that performance, more than one whisper. Charles II, roars 1660-1685. Charles II returned to England not so much as a king, but as an apology in a wig. After the grinding austerity of the Puritan Commonwealth and the public execution of his father, the monarchy had become something of a ghost story. But when Charles stepped back onto English soil in 1660 tall, smirking, impossibly well dressed, it was as if England had finally exhaled. He was crowned with a smile that said, "We're done pretending." History remembers Charles as the merry monarch, the king of pleasure and pageantry, of endless mistresses and restoration comedies. He practically weaponized charm, turning his court into a salon of wit, silk, and occasional treason. He had at least a dozen acknowledged children, not a single one legitimate, and a string of lovers that stretched from theatre stages to noble houses. By all accounts, Charles adored women. And yet, the math never quite adds up. For a king so famous for excess, some of his most emotionally intense relationships had nothing to do with his long list of mistresses and everything to do with the company of certain men who, over time, moved from the background of history to its suspiciously well-lit corners. Take George Villiers, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, the son of James I's favourite. Yes, that George Villiers. He grew up in Charles's orbit, a golden boy with a sharp tongue and a chaotic streak. Their friendship was lifelong and full of contradictions. Villiers was brilliant, unstable, and frequently treacherous. He once tried to lead a rebellion against Charles. The king forgave him, twice. In courtly letters and political appointments, the bond always resurfaced. Charles called him "my peculiar villain," a phrase as affectionate as it is telling. Their relationship defied loyalty, reason, and every sensible rule of royal governance. Then there was Henry Bennet, Earl of Arlington, quieter, more calculating, but just as deeply embedded in the king's inner circle. And behind Bennet, a cast of male courtiers and advisors whose access to the king extended far beyond politics. They were appointed to the Privy Chamber. They shared his hunting lodges. They travelled with him on royal progresses and slept in rooms that were, technically, nearby. Nothing explicit, but always the suggestion of proximity, physical, emotional, and otherwise. Even more curious was the king's fascination with pageantry, not just the theatrical kind, but the cultivated image of masculinity. Charles's court was a performance. He surrounded himself with tall, handsome guardsmen, preferred his servants young and fashionably adorned, and transformed the aesthetics of monarchy into something more sensual than strategic. His court portraits look less like statecraft and more like the cover of an 17th century aristocratic boy band album. And then came the rumors. Not from enemies, those were expected, but from within. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, wrote obliquely of court goings-on that were never clarified. Satirical poems circulated under the table, some hinting that the king's tastes weren't as exclusively heterosexual as his public image suggested. One particularly acidic couplet, published anonymously, claimed the king played both harp and flute, a euphemism not lost on contemporary readers. Of course, in Restoration England, moral boundaries were more flexible than they'd been under Cromwell. Charles's openness about his mistresses gave him a veneer of heterosexual credibility that insulated him against deeper questions. But there were murmurs especially about the men he protected long after their usefulness expired, about the soft-spoken musicians, actors, and gentlemen who moved in and out of royal favour, often without titles but with privileges. Charles never confirmed any of it. He didn't need to. His genius was in keeping everyone entertained enough to stop asking. He gave the public what they wanted: laughter, scandal, a steady drip of palace gossip, and buried his personal loyalties behind a cloud of perfume and powdered wigs. He let history guess, and history still island. Because if Charles II was a king who mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, his successor didn't hide much at all. The next king would inherit the throne with Dutch boots, foreign manners, and a trail of rumours that crossed the channel long before he did. A man whose friendships with young courtiers were so close, so controversial, that Parliament tried to legislate around them, and even then, they couldn't quite reach him. William III, or 1689-1702. William III was not supposed to charm anyone. He didn't have Charles II's easy laugh, James II's tragic glare, or Henry VIII's bombastic flair. He was austere, cerebral, angular, a Calvinist with the social warmth of a frostbitten pine cone. His court was restrained, his clothes were dark, his accent was Dutch. Even his portraits look like he's trying not to enjoy being painted. And yet, William was also one of the most consequential monarchs in British history, co-ruler with his wife Mary after the Glorious Revolution, architect of the constitutional monarchy, and destroyer of the divine right of kings. He won battles, built alliances, and fundamentally reshaped how England would be governed. But amid all the solemn statecraft and Protestant reforms, one thing never quite stopped trailing him: the rumours. Whispers followed William like smoke rumours about the young men he kept close, the sleeping arrangements at court, and the almost gravitational pull he seemed to exert on certain favourites. Some of these whispers were strategic, weaponized by political enemies. Others were private letters, diary entries, and offhand remarks by those who had seen the royal household up close. No one accused him directly, not without layers of euphemism, but the subtext, as always, was thick. Two names come up again and again: Hans Willem Bentinck and Arnold Just van Keppel. Both Dutch, both handsome, both elevated to positions of influence that outraged the English nobility. Let's start with Bentinck. He'd been with William since childhood, a loyal companion, personal confidant, and, later, Earl of Portland. When William came to England in 1688, Bentinck was by his side. When he was crowned, Bentinck stood nearby. Their closeness was never in doubt, but over time, it became too close, at least in the eyes of Parliament. Bentinck received titles, lands, income, and a level of intimacy that, frankly, made a lot of Englishmen uncomfortable. Then came Van Keppel, younger, more fashionable, and far more controversial. William met Arnold when he was still a teenager, and within a few short years, he was at the king's elbow at nearly all public events. He was given the title Earl of Albemarle, placed in command of the Royal Guards, and granted an estate so lavish that it bordered on parody. English courtiers bristled. William didn't care. What made it all more awkward was that William wasn't exactly subtle. He brought Van Keppel on royal tours. He arranged for him to have quarters astonishingly close to his own. He wrote letters to him that, while not romantic by modern standards, were remarkably affectionate, especially for a king known for his emotional reserve. One ambassador, writing in a confidential report back to his government, noted that William cannot sleep without Keppel in the room. Another observed dryly that the young Dutchman has more influence than the whole of the Privy Council combined. The pushback was intense. Parliament, already suspicious of William's foreign entourage, began drafting legislation to limit the influence of non-English courtiers. Some even tried to block Keppel's naturalization. Satirical pamphlets depicted the court as morally degenerate, a playground for foreign favourites. One particularly vicious piece simply called William Queen Mary's better half and another Queen's worse. Still, nothing stuck. William was too powerful, too essential, and too careful. He gave the public war victories, constitutional stability, and Protestant leadership. And unlike Charles II, who drowned suspicion in women and laughter, William simply ignored it. He never explained, never justified, never answered the murmurs. He ruled. His marriage to Mary was cordial, politically functional, and publicly united. They ruled as equals, though. Mary, notably, was not particularly involved in William's personal life. After her death, William grew even more withdrawn, leaning more heavily on Van Keppel. At one point, Bentinck, now jealous of the younger man's access, wrote to William in protest. "I began to lose all that was most dear to me." He was promptly dismissed from court. When William died in 1702 after a riding accident, he left behind no children, no confessions, and no answers. Just a reign that rewrote English governance, and a court whose composition hinted at personal loyalties never officially named. The question lingers, as always. Was it politics? Was it sentiment? Was it something the language of his time didn't allow him to say out loud? Whatever it was, it didn't end with him, because the next few kings born into the new Hanoverian order would inherit more than a constitutional monarchy. They'd inherit the same taste for favourites, the same scandalous whispers, the same questions about what really happened behind palace doors. Starting with a man who brought a full German household across the Channel, including, if you believe the rumours, a few handsome men who weren't just there for the beer. George, the first 1714, 1727. George, I didn't speak English. Not just badly, not at all. When he arrived from Hanover in 1714 to claim the British throne, he was already 54 years old, widowed, grumpy, and utterly uninterested in pretending to be charming. Parliament picked him for political reasons. He was Protestant, reliably dull, and, most importantly, had no ties to the Catholic pretenders still floating around Europe like unwanted ghosts at the royal feast. England needed a safe monarch. What it got was a man who barely pretended to like England, never even tried to like his new subjects, and mostly just wanted to go home. And yet, within the royal apathy, something unusual stirred, because George didn't come alone. He brought with him an entire German household, dozens of courtiers, servants, and advisors, all tightly knit, all fiercely loyal, and many of them young men whose presence stirred uncomfortable questions in the chilly halls of Kensington Palace. The English aristocracy was immediately suspicious. These weren't just aides or translators. They were companions. Handsome, well-dressed, smooth-faced young men who spoke little English, lived at the king's side, and received gifts, titles, and privileges at a pace that far outstripped their political utility. Chief among them was Michael von Bentenrieder, a name barely remembered in most British textbooks, but one that pops up again and again in foreign accounts of George's early years in England. Bentenrieder, a valet and personal attendant, was given rooms within the royal residence and granted access to the king at nearly all hours. He had no official title beyond household staff, yet somehow he received a pension 3 times the size of many baronets. Then there was Melusine von der Schulenburg, the king's official mistress, and her daughter, both of whom were showered with estates and patronage. But even Melusine, widely acknowledged as the king's companion, seemed to play a strange double role, part consort, part cover. Her presence gave George an air of heteronormative normalcy, but those who saw the inner workings of the German court noted that it was not she, but the coterie of young male attendants who truly surrounded the king in private. One such courtier, Friedrich von der Decken, was described in a letter by an Austrian diplomat as always in the king's presence, rarely out of his sight, and far above his official rank. When Parliament tried to question the king's inner circle, they found themselves stonewalled by layers of foreign etiquette and royal silence. George didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply retreated into his world, a hybrid of Hanoverian protocol and English indifference. It didn't help that George openly disliked English customs. He hated London. He hated Parliament. He spent more time in Hanover than in England. He was often absent physically and emotionally. But when he did engage, it was almost always through his familiar retinue of male companions. Satirical poets had a field day. In one anonymous pamphlet, a German prince is mocked for keeping a court of fops and flute players, none of whom could spell Parliament, but all of whom seemed to understand the architecture of royal favour quite well. The insinuation was obvious, and not without precedent. The English elite were used to favouritism. They had tolerated it barely under the Stuarts, but under George it took on a colder, more bureaucratic flavour. These weren't beloved friends of the king. They were foreign, faceless, silent, and yet somehow deeply embedded in the royal routine. The emotional warmth of a James or a Charles was gone. What remained was the structure, a private world where beauty, loyalty, and discretion seemed to buy influence in ways no law could regulate. George's disinterest in court spectacle meant that few records survived to clarify the nature of these relationships. But the financial trail speaks volumes. Enormous pensions to young men with no clear duties, apartments and palaces, jewellery, horses, personalised livery. He may not have spoken English, but George was fluent in the politics of favouritism. When he died in 1727, travelling back to Hanover for the last time, England barely wept. He left no emotional legacy, no charismatic memory. What he left instead was a blueprint, a monarchy that could be emotionally sealed off, politically indifferent, and quietly constructed around a nucleus of silent, loyal, male companions. And his son? His son inherited the throne with a sneer already prepared, and a court that would soon generate the same rumours, the same portraits, and the same uncomfortable questions about why the royal bedchamber always seemed to have more velvet than explanation. George II, R. 1727-1760. George II didn't like his father, and his father didn't like him. Their relationship was cold, formal, and famously petty, the kind of royal drama that would have made for excellent television had anyone in the 18th century been watching. But when George II ascended the throne in 1727, following George I's death on the road back to Hanover, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a model of kingship built on distance, emotional, physical, and, most of all, personal. Where his father had ruled from behind a linguistic and cultural wall, George II tried barely to meet Britain halfway. He spoke better English, showed up at a few more social functions, and made half-hearted attempts at public warmth. But beneath the surface, the old patterns remained. He trusted few. He kept his court close, and, like his predecessors, he surrounded himself with a particular kind of male companion, young, attractive, and suspiciously well-placed. One of the earliest examples was John Hervey, Lord Hervey, a man whose reputation was as polished as his boots. He was intelligent, charismatic, and famously delicate in both manner and appearance. Hervey moved through court like a perfume, subtle, intoxicating, hard to ignore. Though married with children, he was widely rumoured to have enjoyed several relationships with men, most notably Stephen Fox and Henry Fox, two brothers who also floated near the royal orbit. But it was Hervey's relationship with George II that raised the most eyebrows. Hervey became Vice-Chamberlain of the household, a position that brought him into daily contact with the King and Queen. He was sharp-tongued and politically savvy, but what puzzled many was the ease with which he moved between public duty and personal favour. George allowed Hervey into his private apartments, trusted him with matters beyond his title, and treated him with a level of familiarity rare even among family members. Hervey, for his part, referred to the king in terms that were borderline affectionate, even as he criticised his politics in secret memoirs. The Queen, Caroline of Ansbach, seemed to tolerate the bond, perhaps even encourage it. She was a clever political operator in her own right and appeared to understand that Hervey provided something her husband needed, someone to absorb his moods, manage his outbursts, and quietly direct his attention. In Hervey, George found a mirror of his own internal contradictions. Loyalty without noise, beauty without competition, and emotional ease without the risk of scandal, at least not publicly. But Hervey wasn't the only favourite. George's court maintained a steady rotation of young guardsmen and equerries, many of whom were granted appointments far beyond their competence. Several of them were rumoured to have private duties in addition to their military ones, a euphemism used often and never explained. Foreign ambassadors, always more blunt than the British press, sent home letters dripping with innuendo. One Austrian report noted that His Majesty's evening entertainments are more lively than his public addresses, and his fondness for handsome youth is both charming and unaccountable. The French were less diplomatic, referring to George's stable of Adonises. Whether this was exaggerated, malicious, or perfectly accurate, no one can say for certain. But the rumours didn't go away, they just evolved. Much like his father, George II never addressed the gossip. He didn't need to. He had a wife, children, and a country that preferred kings who stayed quiet about their feelings. If Charles II had dazzled the court with mistresses, and William III had quietly shielded his favourites behind political necessity, George II seemed content to operate in the blurred zone between affection and duty, a place where intimacy was veiled in ritual and deniability came pre-packaged with the crown. When Queen Caroline died in 1737, George was devastated. Their marriage, while often portrayed as a political alliance, had grown into something real, a complex bond that included genuine affection. But with her death, he withdrew even further into his private world. The court shrank, his temper flared more often, and the presence of young male attendants became, if anything, more constant. Whether they were confidants, distractions, or something less easily defined, they remained part of his inner circle until the end. George II died in 1760, the last British monarch to be buried at Westminster Abbey. He left behind a legacy of political moderation, war victories, and personal opacity, He was not a revolutionary nor a romantic, but he ruled with the same quiet, stubborn preference for emotional discretion that had become the Hanoverian hallmark. And then came his grandson, loud, sentimental, deeply conservative, and yet, once again, surrounded by whispers. Because while George III would go down in history for losing America and going mad, there was another thread to his life. One embroidered not in laws or declarations, but in satirical pamphlets and worried court murmurs about the curious affections of a king who preached piety and ruled with trembling hands. George III, 10, Rar, 17, 60, 18, 20. George III is the king most people know as the Mad One, the one who lost America, the one who talked to trees, or the moon, or possibly to God, depending on which whisper from the 1,780 seconds you choose to believe. But strip away the myth and medical diagnoses, and you find a much stranger figure. A monarch whose public piety masked a labyrinth of contradictions, including, perhaps, a quietly unspoken queerness hidden beneath layers of moral rigidity and ceremonial smiles. At first glance, George III was the corrective to every scandalous monarch before him. He married one woman, Queen Charlotte, and stayed married to her. He had 15 children. He prayed. He rose early. He hated gambling, distrusted theatre, and didn't drink excessively. He was everything his flamboyant Hanoverian predecessors weren't. And yet, somehow, the rumours followed him too. Unlike his grandfather George II or his great-grandfather George I, George III was born and raised in England. He spoke the language fluently, both literally and culturally, and he leaned heavily into the image of a virtuous English king. But this image was curiously manicured. His court was suspiciously restrained. His personal life was sealed off, and while his marriage was outwardly stable, it was also emotionally distant. Most royal biographers describe George's affection for Queen Charlotte as dutiful rather than passionate. She was intelligent, obedient, and quietly devout. Together, they produced an entire generation of princes and princesses, most of whom became walking metaphors for repression. But even within that seemingly conventional royal household, there were strange undercurrents. For one, George III had a habit of forming intense emotional bonds with young male courtiers, particularly in his early reign. One of the most notable examples was Colonel John Dyke Ackland, a soldier from an aristocratic West Country family who served closely under the king during the 1,770 seconds. Ackland wasn't just trusted, he was adored. Letters from the time hint at an unusually close relationship, with the king going out of his way to secure Ackland's appointments, pensions, and personal safety in wartime. More famously, Francis Willis, the physician who treated George during his first major mental breakdown, noted in a private memorandum that the king often spoke of attachments formed in youth, stronger than the bounds of politics or rank. The note is maddeningly vague, and yet it's there, lingering. Then there are the satirical pamphlets, especially those printed during the more volatile years of George's reign. One widely circulated cartoon depicted the king surrounded by his whispering pages, a clear nod to the young male attendants who always seemed to hover just a little too close in royal portraits. Another scathing piece, published in the 1,790 seconds by an anonymous Whig sympathizer, accused the king of ungentlemanly partialities for his uniformed shadows. Euphemism. Again, doing all the heavy lifting. And while many of these accusations were politically motivated, they didn't come out of nowhere. George's emotional restraint was legendary, but it often seemed to conceal something deeper, not just mental instability, but personal longing. The kind of longing that, in 18th century England, had no safe outlet. He preached Christian virtue. He outlawed immorality. He reigned as a father to the nation. But his inner world remained opaque, intensely private, and frequently scrutinized for what it didn't show. There's also the strange, well-documented fact that his sons, particularly George IV, openly mocked their father's coldness toward women. They joked about his monastic preferences, his lack of mistresses, his refusal to visit certain areas of the court. While it's easy to write this off as rebellious posturing, it adds to the atmosphere of suspicion that quietly enveloped George throughout his reign. And then there's his final descent into illness. When his mental state collapsed entirely in the early 19th century, George was removed from public life and placed in the care of his attendants, all of them male, all of them hand-picked. During his years in seclusion at Windsor, visitors noted how he often refused to speak of his wife or daughters, but could recall in minute detail the names, faces, and habits of pages and courtiers from 40 years prior. He died in 1820, blind, deaf, and long since removed from power. By then, his image had been rehabilitated into a sort of tragic saint, the king who went mad but meant well. But beneath that image was a man whose personal attachments, however discreet, never quite fit the mold of the devout patriarch he pretended to be. And when the crown passed to his eldest son, George IV, the pattern didn't just continue, it exploded, because the next king would be too extravagant, too emotional, and too obvious. A monarch mocked as effeminate, adored for his beauty, and surrounded once again by far too many young men with no clear job descriptions. George IV, 1820, 1830. If George III was the restrained father figure of the British monarchy, all discipline, piety, and forced composure, then his son George IV was the performance that followed the curtain drop, the after-party, the powdered, perfumed, scandal-drenched rebuttal to everything his father stood for. Even before ascending the throne, George had made a name for himself not through war or politics, but through extravagance, gossip, and a theatrical mastery of image that would make modern celebrities blush. He was, in every way, a spectacle, and he knew it. During his long tenure as Prince of Wales, George styled himself as a tastemaker. He threw lavish balls, remodeled palaces, wore more lace than most of the actresses he flirted with, and cultivated an image of refined excess. But beneath all the royal drag and diamond buttons lay a quieter series of choices, personal attachments, and social arrangements that raised far more eyebrows than his debts or his diet. While George is best known for his highly public affair and illegal marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow whom he loved and abandoned in the most operatic fashion, his emotional world didn't seem to run exclusively along that well-worn heterosexual track. In fact, the whispers about his male companions were present from his earliest years at Carlton House, and they never fully went away. One such figure was Colonel George Hanger, a charismatic and eccentric soldier who spent a significant amount of time in the prince's inner circle. Hanger was loud, unapologetically flamboyant in personality, and known for his colourful memoirs, in which he made several thinly veiled references to the personal dynamics of court life. While many dismissed him as comic relief, his closeness to George was well documented. He was part of a tight male clique that included not just soldiers, but artists, poets, and the occasional well-dressed dilettante whose only clear job was to be around. And it was a glittering circle. The Prince of Wales was frequently surrounded by young men of exceptional beauty and questionable qualifications, many of whom appeared in paintings, memoirs, and satirical prints. The famed caricaturist James Gilray published dozens of biting images mocking George's effeminate mannerisms, extravagant wardrobe, and suspiciously intimate friendships with his chamberlains and valets. One particularly popular cartoon from the 1790 seconds depicts George draped in silks, whispering to a powdered young man while women watch on, ignored. The caption reads, "The Queen of Hearts and his card boy." Of course, it wasn't just satire. Foreign ambassadors, ever the professional gossips, wrote home about the peculiar diversions of the Prince of Wales. One Austrian diplomat noted that George's intimacy with certain gentlemen of the household exceeds what is customary, even in England. The French, ever dramatic, simply dubbed his court the Versailles of Velvet Boys. Then there was the matter of George's fashion itself. He practically invented the dandy. His obsession with tailoring, fabric, posture, and physical presentation was so intense that it bordered on identity. He elevated Beau Brummel, the original Regency dandy, to the level of royal confidant, a man famous for nothing other than knowing how to wear a waistcoat. Brummel, who was widely rumoured to prefer the company of men, was granted astonishing access to George's private world before their eventual, and dramatic, falling out. Even then, George never quite escaped Brummel's influence, nor the comparisons it provoked. Despite his countless affairs with women, George left behind very few genuine romantic correspondences. What survived were performances. Letters dripping with melodrama, declarations of heartbreak that felt more theatrical than sincere. When Maria Fitzherbert died, he was buried with a miniature of her, which many took as a sign of enduring love. Others, however, pointed out that this gesture came at the end of a life spent bouncing between shallow connections and unusually intense male friendships that often went unspoken but never unnoticed. When George IV finally took the throne in 1820, after decades of acting like a monarch without the paperwork, he ruled for just 10 years. His reign was marked by excess, bloated ceremonialism, and public ridicule. The people called him a fat Adonis, mocked his parades, and sneered at his emotional volatility. But beneath the wigs and waistcoats, there remained the same quiet riddle. Why did the king, so desperate for adoration, always seem to place his deepest trust and quietest loyalties in the company of men who said very little, but stayed very close? He died bloated, isolated, and grotesquely overdressed, wearing, according to some reports, over a dozen layers of clothing. The king who had spent his life wrapping himself in symbols left behind a body no one quite wanted to undress. And the next monarch? Well, he'd shed the silks, but not the pattern. Because while William IV preferred a sailor's coat to a velvet robe and fathered a boatload of illegitimate children, there were still rumours whispering in the wind, rumours about his naval days, his bunkmates, and the kinds of friendships that salt water doesn't always wash away. William IV, 1830–1837. William IV never expected to be king. He had spent most of his life floating just outside the royal spotlight, a second-tier prince with no real political clout, known more for his erratic behaviour and naval escapades than any grand vision of monarchy. He was the third son of George III, which made him the sort of royal who was allowed to be eccentric. And William, to his credit, took full advantage. Before his unexpected ascension to the throne at the age of 64, William had already lived what could generously be called a colourful life. He served decades in the Royal Navy, where he earned the nickname the Sailor King, though few were quite sure whether that was meant as praise or a cautionary label. He openly shunned the stiff court life preferred by his older brother, George IV, and made no real effort to charm the public. But he also didn't hide. That was part of the mystery. William had a long-term relationship with the Irish actress Dorothea Bland, known as Mrs. Jordan, with whom he fathered 10 children. Their domestic life, while unconventional, was stable and even tender. But for all its scandalous appearance, it was oddly conservative, more of a practical partnership than a grand romance. After they separated, William moved on to a number of other women, none of whom he married until much later in life, and none of whom seemed to occupy quite the same emotional territory. And then there were his naval years, the part of his life most often glossed over by royal historians and most enthusiastically dissected by everyone else. During his time as a young officer, William was posted aboard several Royal Navy vessels, where he lived in tight, intimate quarters with other men, often for months at a time, with long voyages, high stress, and very few boundaries. This wasn't unusual for naval officers of the period. What was unusual, however, were the enduring attachments he seemed to form with certain shipmates, and the peculiar reluctance of later biographers to explore them in detail. One such figure was Captain George Grey, a fellow naval officer and lifelong friend who remained close to William long after their sea days had passed. Grey received several promotions that were not strictly warranted by merit and was often found at William's side during official functions long after their professional connection should have faded. Letters between them are polite but marked with a kind of coded warmth, the kind that doesn't raise eyebrows unless you know what to look for. There's also the fact that William, despite his reputation for bluntness and boorish jokes, consistently defended certain male courtiers who were accused, sometimes quite publicly, of unmanly behavior. When questioned, he would shrug it off or shift the topic. On at least one occasion, he reportedly told a critic that he valued loyalty above all else and didn't care for witch hunts in breeches. It's a strange statement, unless you know what it's pushing back against. William's court was smaller than his brother's, less grand, less theatrical, but still carefully composed. Several of his closest attendants were young naval men from his past, given positions of ceremonial responsibility despite a lack of aristocratic credentials. Parliament didn't love it, the public barely noticed, but the pattern was there, quiet and consistent. Perhaps most revealing is how William handled gossip. He didn't threaten lawsuits like George IV. He didn't go silent like George III. He joked, he laughed. He deflected with crude humor, turning any uncomfortable question into a punchline. This strategy worked well. So well, in fact, that even now, his personal life remains a blank space, between anecdotes, a sea chart with missing islands. He reigned for just 7 years and died without legitimate heirs, making way for the ascension of his niece, Victoria. History quickly filed William IV under transitional monarch, a footnote between Georgian flamboyance and Victorian decorum. But that label ignores the subtle contradictions of his life. The sailor who avoided marriage for decades, the father of illegitimate children who nevertheless preferred the company of old shipmates, the king who wore his past like an open secret and dared people to ask. And ask they did, just never quite out loud. Because the next monarch didn't leave space for rumors. She didn't need favorites. She didn't need intimacy. She needed legacy. And she built it brick by brick in widow's black, with a scowl. But when her son took the throne after her, the pattern would return, this time in an era of cameras, tabloids, and growing suspicions about the private lives of public kings. Starting with a man known for his mistresses, and yet still whispered about for what or who might have been missing. Edward VII, or 1901, 1910. Edward VII was the very image of late imperial indulgence, portly, jovial, endlessly photographed in tailored morning coats and surrounded by every comfort an empire could provide. As the eldest son of Queen Victoria, he waited nearly 6 decades to become king, spending most of his life in a strange royal purgatory, too powerful to ignore, too idle to contain. And so he lived, lavishly, extravagantly, publicly. He's most famously remembered for his mistresses, dozens of them, many married, all scandalous, society women, actresses, aristocrats. He was rumoured to have his own custom-built lovemaking chair. There are entire books dedicated to chronicling his liaisons, ranking them like prize winners at a royal livestock show. This is the narrative we're told. Edward was a libertine, a lover, a man who couldn't say no to a beautiful woman. But when everyone is looking at the women, it becomes much easier to stop asking about the men. And here's where the story gets quieter. In the shadow of the official narrative, the cigars, the champagne, the crimson wallpaper, there's a quieter set of relationships. Less recorded, less public, but no less consistent. Edward was not a solitary prince. He kept a court. And many of the men in it bore striking similarities, young, fashionable, and fiercely loyal. Several of them rose through the ranks with inexplicable speed, carrying titles they hadn't necessarily earned, posted to roles that seemed tailor-made for constant proximity. One such man was Francis Knollys, Edward's private secretary. Knollys served Edward for decades, from his days as Prince of Wales through his reign as king. Their bond was practically symbiotic. Knollys handled Edward's schedules, his travel, his correspondence, and according to multiple sources, much of his emotional life. He was more than an aide. He was the architect of Edward's daily existence. Even after Knollys was elevated to the peerage and given the title Viscount, he remained inseparably close to the king. One observer noted that Sir Francis did not merely serve the king, he knew him, and everyone who knew them understood what that meant. Then there was Maurice de Hirsch, a fabulously wealthy banker and philanthropist who maintained a long friendship with Edward, one that raised diplomatic eyebrows when the two men vacationed together alone for weeks on end. Edward also showed intense personal interest in James Neil, an officer and personal equerry who appeared, with no clear explanation, at every major event during Edward's late years. Like so many favourites before him, Neil left almost no paper trail, just a recurring name on guest lists, payrolls, and photographs. It's possible, of course, that Edward's life was simply a study in overindulgence, that he loved everyone too much, too frequently, and with no regard for category. But some biographers have quietly questioned the imbalance. If Edward's life was so overrun with romantic chaos, why do his private letters, the ones not intended for public display, so rarely speak of passion? Why are his emotional expressions reserved, deliberate, and, in some cases, oddly fixated on male companionship? One French diplomat, after attending a royal hunting party, wrote, "The king seems most alive in the company of his gentlemen in the dining room, not the boudoir." He meant it as a compliment. It's still a clue. When Edward died in 1910, the empire mourned him as the last great social monarch, a man who partied as hard as he ruled. But beneath the satin and smoke rings, there remains a curious absence, a lifelong hunger for affection that never seems fully satisfied, no matter how many mistresses you count. And if you look hard enough, you begin to notice that the ones who stayed, who outlasted the women, the scandals, the politics, were often men. Which brings us to his son George V, who reacted to his father's excess not by rejecting intimacy altogether, but by retreating into a shell of duty, discipline, and secrecy. A king who didn't play at decadence, but still managed to inspire the same quiet rumors about the men he couldn't quite seem to let go of. George V, or 1910-1936. George V was a study in restraint. Quiet, stern, unflashy. If Edward VII had been England's imperial party host, George was the man who showed up the next morning to clean up the mess. He spoke plainly, dressed modestly, and famously preferred stamp collecting to socialising. His reign saw the decline of British imperial confidence, the Great War, and the slow encroachment of modernity, all of which he faced with the emotional range of a granite wall. But if George kept his emotions under wraps, that didn't mean he didn't have them. And, as with so many kings before him, they found expression not in grand declarations or romantic entanglements, but in quiet, deliberate relationships with a handful of young men whose careers, access, and proximity far outstripped their official roles. As Prince of Wales, George served in the Royal Navy, and it was there, far from the prying eyes of the court, that his most emotionally revealing friendships began to form. One such figure was Lieutenant Henry Chips Chichester, a fellow naval officer and companion during George's early years at sea. Their friendship lasted well beyond their shared service, with Chichester appearing on royal itineraries for years afterward. According to court memoirs, George wrote to him regularly, sometimes daily, with letters that mixed formality and warmth in odd, uneven proportions. Later in life, George developed a strong attachment to Sir Frederick Ponsonby, his private secretary, and the gatekeeper of royal routine. Ponsonby managed the king's schedule, yes, but also his moods, anxieties, and silences. He became a kind of emotional translator, capable of anticipating George's reactions and smoothing over his social discomfort. The king liked order, Ponsonby once wrote, and he trusted only a very few to impose it gently. Ponsonby was rewarded with titles, lands, and a degree of influence unusual for someone with no formal political office. George also took a particular interest in Lord Stamfordham, another courtier whose influence was quietly profound. Stamfordham was reserved and deeply loyal, two traits the king valued above all. And while no personal letters survive between them, references in staff journals suggest that Stamfordham often slept within a few doors of the king, a proximity that, while perhaps logistical, echoes a familiar pattern among royal favourites. None of this was ever made explicit. George was a man of silence. He disapproved of gossip, discouraged memoirs, and destroyed many of his own papers. But despite, or perhaps because of this careful curation, rumours still found their way in. Members of the court, especially during the post-war years, spoke quietly of the king's preference for male company and the unusually affectionate way he referred to certain attendants. His marriage to Queen Mary was famously formal. They respected each other deeply, but warmth was rare. The Queen herself once noted, "He was a good man, not an easy man." They slept in separate rooms. They wrote letters to communicate even while in the same building. Mary tolerated the king's emotional evasions. She had no choice. George V died in 1936, remembered as a stabilizing force in a crumbling empire. But even his death was controlled. His physician famously administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to ensure he died before the morning papers, allowing the announcement to appear with due dignity. That detail tells you everything about his reign. Image over emotion, control over truth. And yet, behind that cold legacy, the whispering continued, about the men, about the pages, about the ways in which emotional loyalty was rewarded behind locked palace doors, And those whispers would roar back louder than ever in his son, Edward VIII, whose relationships, both male and female, would spark not just rumour, but full-blown constitutional crisis. Edward VIII does come. 1936. Edward VIII reigned for less than a year. No coronation, no ceremony. Just an abdication, a scandal, and a love story that has been repeated so often it's calcified into national folklore. The king who gave up the throne for the woman he loved. But as with so many royal narratives, this one's neatness conceals more than it reveals. Yes, Wallis Simpson was the catalyst. An American divorcee, twice married, socially brilliant, and politically toxic. But long before she entered the picture, Edward, known simply as David to family and friends, had already earned a reputation at court for relationships that strayed from the expected path. And many of those relationships were not with women. From his time as Prince of Wales, Edward preferred a lifestyle that hovered somewhere between bohemian and theatrical. He cultivated friendships with dancers, artists, fashion designers and, most notably, a series of handsome young men whose names appear again and again in court records, gossip columns, and confidential diplomatic reports. Among them was Louis Mountbatten, later the Earl Mountbatten of Burma, who maintained a famously complex relationship with Edward throughout their youth. While Mountbatten later married and fathered children, his early correspondence with Edward was marked by an unusually intense intimacy. Whether platonic or romantic, the closeness of their bond and the emotional vocabulary they used with each other raised eyebrows even at the time. Even more telling was Edward's deep friendship with Walter Monckton, a courtier and advisor who remained one of his most trusted confidants during the abdication crisis. Their letters, while measured, reveal a kind of emotional codependency. Monckton's advice carried immense weight, and while he is often portrayed as simply a legal aid, his presence in Edward's private circle hints at something deeper. Then there were the parties. The long weekends in the south of France, the beach holidays in Biarritz, the yacht trips in the Mediterranean, always staffed, it seemed, with more valets and equerries than protocol strictly required. In one case, a foreign ambassador wrote, "The prince travels with an entourage that would not look out of place in an opera, all glitter and no explanation." While Edward's affair with Wallis took centre stage, it may also have functioned, at least in part, as a shield, a socially scandalous relationship that still, somehow, confirmed heterosexual norms. It gave the public something to focus on while the palace quietly edited out the rest. Even after his abdication, the rumours didn't stop. In exile, Edward was surrounded once again by male companions, charming, beautiful, discreet. His marriage to Wallis appeared emotionally flat, even performative. They were a pair, yes, but never quite lovers in the way the story insists. More co-conspirators than soulmates. Edward VIII became the Duke of Windsor and spent the rest of his life hovering at the edges of royal legitimacy. His legacy is frozen by that singular choice, throne or love. But perhaps the more accurate choice was image or truth, and in choosing Wallis, he bought himself a lifetime's worth of plausible deniability. And yet, the pattern returned again in the man who followed him. His younger brother George VI, who reigned quietly through a world war, stiff in speech, modest in ambition, and, if you read between the lines, just as quietly surrounded by a familiar kind of company. George VI roared 1936-1952. George VI was the accidental king, the quiet, stammering second son thrust onto the throne after his older brother detonated the monarchy with a single love affair. He never wanted the job. He wasn't built for it. But history, inconveniently, doesn't care about personal preference. What followed was a reign defined by duty, silence, and a kind of internalized panic. George VI became king in a time of crisis, abdication, fascism, world war, and he responded the only way he knew how, by disappearing into the role. He became the symbol of wartime stability, of stoicism in the face of horror, of Britain's ability to endure. And yet, behind the war speeches and newsreel smiles was a man still deeply uncomfortable in his own skin. George was married to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, later known as the Queen Mother, and they maintained a strong domestic partnership, but it was never a romance built on passion. Their union was structured, proper, and entirely in line with the kind of king he was trying desperately to become. It was designed for public reassurance. Privately, though, George continued the same quiet pattern established by his ancestors, an inner court of male companions, trusted above all others, who orbited around him with roles that were never fully explained. One of the most enduring of these relationships was with Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, his private secretary. Lascelles was more than a bureaucrat. He was the king's shadow, stern, loyal, emotionally intelligent, and ever-present. While their correspondence is mostly clipped and formal, Lascelles was famously discreet. The sheer volume of communication between the two men, and the ease with which George relied on him for emotional support, has led some historians to quietly question whether their relationship was purely professional. Other figures such as Group Captain Peter Townsend also complicate the story. Townsend is best remembered today for his romantic entanglement with Princess Margaret, but he first entered royal life as equerry to George VI. He was young, athletic, polished, and spent an unusually large amount of time in the king's private household. His closeness to the royal family began during the war, when George increasingly relied on a handful of such men to buffer him from the pressures of leadership. These weren't just aides, they were emotional scaffolding. Then there were the unnamed, the valets, pages, personal attendants whose names rarely made it into official documents but who appear again and again in palace logs and photographs, always close by, always just behind the frame. During wartime, this arrangement had plausible cover. The king needed support, needed staff, needed structure. But as the years passed and the war ended, some of those companions remained long after the logistics required them. They were given pensions, knighthoods, and, in a few cases, quiet homes on royal property. The thank you cards were not made public. Rumors persisted. Of course, mostly within elite circles. But George, like his father before him, never gave anything away. He lived within a shell of British reserve so thick it could be mistaken for emptiness, and perhaps it was. His health deteriorated in his later years, worn down by stress, chain-smoking, and a deep anxiety that never really left him. He died in 1952, suddenly and quietly, at the age of 56. The newspapers called him a good man. They weren't wrong. But good isn't the same as known. And even now, his emotional life remains shadowed not by scandal, but by absence. The kind of absence that suggests something was always just out of view. And what came next, the long reign of his daughter Elizabeth, would bury these patterns beneath layers of symbolic stability. But before her coronation, before the monarchy was scrubbed clean for the television era, there remained a few final echoes of the old world. One of them came in the form of a medieval king who didn't seem to belong to the 15th century at all, a man whose private loyalties once again became a matter of dangerous speculation. Henry V, or 14, 13, 14, 22. Henry V is the king of heroic myth, Shakespeare's silver-tongued soldier, the victor of Agincourt, the English lion who humbled the French and died too soon. He was brave, austere, and famously focused. A warlord with a monk's haircut. No frills, no distractions, no softness. That, at least, is the official story. But once again, we find that the neat version of a king's life often leaves things out, because even a warrior king needs companions, and even a legend has shadows. Before he became king, Henry spent his youth on the battlefield. He was captured in Wales, fought rebellions, and learned leadership not from a throne, but from mud and blood and tents. In this early life, he forged bonds with soldiers that went far deeper than simple camaraderie. Among these, none stood out more than Sir John Oldcastle, a knight and nobleman who, in time, would inspire Shakespeare's original version of Falstaff before being rewritten into something less politically awkward. Oldcastle and Henry were close, unnervingly so, according to some chronicles. They trained together, fought together, and shared ideas about religion that would later become dangerously controversial. When Oldcastle was declared a heretic for his Lollard beliefs, Henry tried to protect him even after it was politically unwise to do so. He postponed trials, ignored advisors, and refused to renounce him until Oldcastle's rebellion made it impossible. Why did he wait so long? Why risk scandal and political fallout to defend a man everyone else had written off as dangerous? Some have called it loyalty. Others, sentiment. A few whisper love. The relationship between Henry and Oldcastle is one of the few areas in his life where emotion seems to override strategy. Even after Oldcastle's execution, Henry continued to favour young men in his military retinue, not nobles, not landed lords, but men elevated quickly through the ranks, given command and proximity far beyond their station. These weren't just soldiers. They were his world, his emotional foundation. When one died, Sir Edmund Mortimer, a friend and sometimes rival the king, entered a documented period of mourning, withdrawing from public events and cancelling scheduled appearances. It was an unusual gesture for a king who rarely showed softness. Henry never married until he needed to, and even then, it was a political move. His union with Catherine of Valois was designed to cement his claim to the French throne. Their interactions were cordial, perhaps even fond, but never passionate. He died just 2 years into the marriage, before their child could even walk. The story sold to the public was one of glory and sacrifice. The story hidden beneath was one of isolation. He died in 1422. In his mid-30s, worn down by war and dysentery. His funeral was a spectacle. The man, however, remained distant even in death. And yet the men he left behind told another story. One of fierce emotional bonds, private devotion, and the kind of personal politics that wouldn't be seen again until the fragile reign of his son, Henry VI. Roar 1422, 1461, 1470, 1471. If Henry V was the soldier king, then his son, Henry VI, was the ghost left behind. A boy king who inherited an empire and ruled it like a monk lost in a cathedral. He was gentle, deeply religious, and utterly unsuited to the brutal machinery of 15th century politics. His reign would be defined by collapse of land, of legacy, of self. And once again, the rumours would follow. From a young age, Henry was noted for his discomfort around women and his intense attachment to male courtiers. He showed little interest in marriage and none in traditional courtly love. His emotional life centred around his closest advisors, men like Adam Malines, William de la Pole, and Edmund Beaufort, all of whom were accused at various points of manipulating the king's affections for political gain. In particular, his relationship with de la Pole raised eyebrows. As Duke of Suffolk, de la Pole was Henry's constant companion, trusted to an almost irrational degree. He negotiated Henry's marriage, handled royal finances, and often acted as the king's proxy in both public and private matters. When de la Pole was accused of treason, Henry defended him to the end, even as the evidence mounted and Parliament demanded his exile. Contemporaries noted Henry's aversion to women and unnatural chastity. He fathered only one child, Edward of Westminster, and many whispered that the boy was not his. Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's formidable wife, was widely believed to have conceived the heir through someone else, a rumour so persistent it shadowed Edward's entire life. Meanwhile, Henry's inner circle became increasingly populated by monks, chaplains, and scholars men whose company offered spiritual comfort but also ensured emotional dependence. Chroniclers describe scenes of the king sitting for hours in chapel, surrounded by young clerics, engaged in theological debates, or simply lost in thought. He seemed at peace there in male company, far from the expectations of courtly masculinity. When civil war erupted and the Wars of the Roses began, Henry retreated further. His mental health collapsed. He would disappear for months at a time into a silent, vacant state. During these absences, it was often his male companions, not his wife, who tended to him. When he was briefly restored to the throne in 1470, it was more as a figurehead than a ruler. The men around him changed, but the pattern remained. The king, surrounded by quiet, loyal men, unable or unwilling to engage in the public theatre of power. He was murdered in 1471, likely on the orders of Edward IV. His death was quiet, unceremonious. The last of a line of kings whose emotional world was built not in treaties or heirs, but in the shadows of private loyalty. And it wouldn't be the last time a king's most dangerous secret wore armour, called itself loyalty, and vanished without explanation. Stephen Orr, 1135–1154. Stephen of Blois, who seized the English throne in 1135, was a king born out of chaos and destined to rule in it. His reign marked one of the most lawless and blood-drenched periods in English history. The Anarchy, a civil war so messy that one chronicler famously described it with the blunt honesty of a survivor. Christ and his saints slept, but amid the bloodshed, castle sieges, and famine, there was another, more peculiar layer to Stephen's kingship, one less written about, but quietly echoed in the margins of court documents, rival gossip, and the sudden rise of certain young men. Stephen wasn't the obvious heir. The rightful successor after Henry I's death was Empress Matilda, Henry's only surviving legitimate child. But Stephen acted fast. Charming, pragmatic, and popular among the barons, he rushed to Westminster, got himself crowned, and told the church it was God's will. That decision split the realm in two for nearly 2 decades. Matilda's claim was strong. Stephen's power was fragile. And, like many kings in his position, he quickly learned to surround himself with loyalty, particularly in the form of knights and companions who pledged allegiance to him alone. One name that surfaces often in early accounts is William of Ypres, a Flemish mercenary and one of Stephen's closest allies. William wasn't just a battlefield commander, he was a fixture at court, described as having the king's ear and enjoying unnatural influence. In a time when power was won by brute strength, William gained his through proximity, a kind of quiet access that made chroniclers suspicious and political rivals furious. Stephen knighted William, gave him land, and treated him, in many ways, like a brother. Some suggested something closer. The language used in early 12th century chronicles to describe their bond intimate, inseparable, unnaturally fond, is cryptic, but consistent. William had no noble title, no real claim to English land, and yet he lived as a near equal. When accused of misconduct or overreach, Stephen shielded him every time. Then there was Hugh Bigod, the nobleman whose convenient eyewitness testimony of Henry I's alleged deathbed declaration in favour of Stephen helped justify the king's claim. Bigod's relationship with Stephen wasn't just transactional, it became long-lasting, with Bigod rewarded handsomely. Though less romantically tinged in the chronicles, his closeness to Stephen during the most precarious years of the anarchy speaks to the king's reliance on a small circle of men who offered loyalty without question, and who received protection, titles, and land in return. And while Stephen was married to Matilda of Boulogne, a woman of considerable political skill, their relationship was more strategic than affectionate. She played the role of regent during her husband's absences, raising armies and managing the kingdom's defences. They were a formidable team on paper, but there is little evidence of emotional intimacy between them. Instead, Stephen's warmest recorded words were reserved for the men who rode with him, dined with him, and died for him. When peace was finally brokered in 1153, it was under the condition that Stephen would remain king for life, but name Matilda's son, the future Henry II, as his successor. He died the following year, not in battle, but in exhaustion, worn out, used up. History remembers him as a weak king trapped in endless war. But perhaps the more accurate reading is this: a man who trusted too few, too deeply. And like so many kings before and after him, he left behind a trail not just of political failures, but of emotional mysteries, young men who rose too fast, stayed too long, and vanished from the record just before it could explain them. The next king would be anything but weak. Ruthless, shrewd, and scandal-plagued, he ruled with iron, made enemies of everyone, and, if the gossip is to be believed, never quite settled his affections within the bounds of the church, the court, or even convention. John or 11, 99-12-16. King John is remembered as a villain. Not just a bad king, the bad king. The tax-hiking, land-losing, Pope-excommunicating disaster who signed the Magna Carta under threat of civil war. He's the template for every corrupt monarch in British fiction, most notably as the snivelling coward opposite Robin Hood. But buried beneath the clichés and legitimate catastrophes lies a more complicated and frankly more intriguing Figure 1 whose private life was as murky as his political one. From the outset, John's reputation was plagued by accusations of moral perversion, some likely invented by enemies, others suspiciously persistent. Among the many charges hurled at him, one stands out with particular venom: vile sodomy. That phrase appears in multiple contemporary sources, including the chronicler Roger of Wendover, who didn't mince words when accusing the king of indulging in unnatural acts with male companions. Was it propaganda? Very likely. But as with all effective political slander, it only works if it already sounds plausible. One of the most suspicious figures in John's orbit was Peter des Roches, a Poitevin churchman who became one of the king's most trusted advisors. Des Roches, who served as Bishop of Winchester, had an unusually close relationship with the king, riding with him across England, managing his household finances, and even acting as his spiritual director. In one letter, John referred to him as "my most beloved Peter," a phrase that would raise no alarms in Latin, but in the context of the mounting gossip, was grist for the mill. Another curious character was Hubert de Burgh, who began his career as a household knight and eventually rose to Chief Justiciar of England. Hubert's rise was meteoric, and his closeness to John was remarked upon even by foreign observers. The two men were often seen traveling together with minimal entourage, spending long hours in private conversation. While there's no surviving correspondence between them that's explicitly intimate, the pattern is familiar, a low-born knight elevated through personal loyalty rather than noble birth, and granted influence far beyond his rank. John's court, though less documented than his father Henry II's or his brother Richard's, shows the same pattern of tightly clustered male companionship, sudden promotions, and uneasy relationships with the church. Unlike his predecessors, however, John seemed to cultivate his favourites with an open disdain for public opinion. He wasn't interested in appearances, he didn't care who gossiped, and that made him dangerous. His marriage to Isabella of Angoulême was famously loveless, a political move from start to finish. Though she bore him children, she was largely kept away from the centre of power. John's affections, if they existed at all, were not spent on her. By the end of his reign, John was so widely despised that even the barons turned against him. Magna Carta was not just a list of grievances, it was a declaration of distrust in a king who seemed to rule by impulse and personal whim. That included, some whispered, his vile appetites. After he died in 1216, likely from dysentery, no great mourning followed. England, quite simply, exhaled. But even villains leave traces. And if you dig through the ashes of John's reign, you find a court built not just on cruelty, but on intimacy. The kind of closeness that made powerful men nervous, not because they feared incompetence, but because they saw something else entirely, something personal. And that shadow of fear, favour, and whispered affection would echo centuries later in another king's reign. A boy with red hair, riding into a forest, never to return. A king whose death came as suddenly as it came, suspiciously leaving behind no heirs, no wife, and a court full of unanswered questions.